Distinguished members of the audience, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. I know we are short of time, so I had actually compiled about 15 points, which will allow me to keep well within 20 minutes. The first thing is what we must understand. The Air Marshal has very methodically brought out the technical aspects that went into planning and how the ASAT targeting was done. But what we need to understand is that India's scientific capability, and especially the capability of our scientists to produce missiles. I remember reading a book by Yandy Nolan called The Trappings of Power. And I read it long ago, and she said, it's a juggernaut that cannot be contained. So while it's ironical that we produce world-class satellites and world-class capability in the cost, as the Prime Minister said at Madison Square Gardens, of less than a Hollywood movie. And we can send satellites across to Mars. And even Chandrayaan, which didn't take off the other day, it would eventually be much, much cheaper than any similar mission that has been taken on by anybody else. But our scientists and all need to be brought into the forefront, to be given credit for the exceptional talent they have. And I think it is, while the Prime Minister made the announcement and all the media cameras were focused on the Prime Minister, but I think much more importance should have been given to the people behind the scenes who've worked with pinpoint accuracy to achieve, as the Air Marshal brought out, this great achievement of ASAT. Why is it a great achievement? Firstly, it exhibits India's scientific capabilities. Secondly, it exhibits India's engineering capabilities. Thirdly, it exhibits that wherever we have been put under restraint because of strategic constraints, MTCR is one of them, the various international rules and regulations which don't allow you to get any help from outside, our people have gone and put out world-class stuff in the global arena. And where there are no restraints, and my fraternity, that is the military fraternity, is the biggest defaulter in that, is responsible then for not really giving much importance to indigenous productions, but going to buy the best for the boys, which is in terms of aircrafts, missiles, whatever else. Often these purchases are made in a crisis mode. But what this shows is that if we work on a specific timeline, we work towards a planned pattern, we can achieve miracles. Why this is also important is because, as was brought out in the video conference call, that a few days later, another set of restrictions would have come into play. And those restrictions are experience of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, where Article 6 of the NPT says very clearly that as of 1968, when the NPT was put into place, those who had bombs can continue to have bombs and make more bombs. And those who don't have bombs can never have bombs. I think it's ridiculous, and therefore it received the dismissive approach from successive Indian governments that it deserves. And when we finally did, I can never understand what a peaceful nuclear test is, but when we did the test in 1974, then another cartel of countries was created called the NSG to restrict the supply of nuclear technology to us, so that we could not go into the next stage, which we did eventually in 1998. And I'm told Madeleine Albright, at that time America's Secretary of State and rather powerful woman, who single-handedly stopped the second term for Boutros Ghali to become UN Secretary General, told the Indian delegation that you've blown a hole through the NPT. So the NPT be damned as far as I'm concerned. Now, when we look at what we have gone on to achieve with the ASAT test, I think we've achieved multiple things. The first achievement is that we've shown that despite restrictions on technology, we've been responsible. China did the test in 2007, and we have heard talk about debris which is floating around. Some people say that that debris from the Chinese test will be around for the next 10 years. Our debris will get written off in the next few months. Much of it is going to be pulled back into the Earth's atmosphere because of gravity, and en route get burnt off. So effectively, our debris is not going to be floating around and suddenly create accidents among satellites, which are expensive. Though I had seen one very smart young Indian scientist at a recent conference organized by CISC, the Integrated Service Headquarters, on space. And this Indian scientist had worked for all the big names in America, and he showed a little box of this nature and opened the wings, and he says, you know, you could put out a satellite of this size in space. So obviously it'll be more expensive than a box of chocolates. But the fact of the matter is you can put out at this space. So with the number of satellites that are going around all over, the possibility of debris damaging somebody else's investment and then damaging somebody else's information gathering efforts, good or bad, whatever they be, the possibility is high. Ours was a responsible test. The other point is that India has always been opposed to weaponization of space. It's been said officially, but I think there is a question that emerges: to what extent can weaponization be curtailed under the Outer Space Treaty of 1967, which effectively says that by placing weapons of mass destruction on the Earth's orbit or on the moon or other celestial bodies, the treaty does not allow that, and by placing that, obviously you're going to go against the treaty. But at the same time, it could give a window for weaponization, because the treaty needs to be reviewed and it only prohibits weapons of mass destruction. It doesn't prohibit conventional weapon systems for being in space, which is aircraft, missiles, whatever else, as long as there are no nukes added on to it. So therefore, there is a time, and I think India has sent out a message to the world by design or default, that we need to consider reviewing that treaty, and maybe if we don't want the space, the entire frontier of the space to be weaponized, then we should come up with new rules which clearly says you cannot be weaponized. But that again does not stall or stop countries from using satellite technology for military purposes, for reconnaissance, for identifying pattern of movement of ships and fleets, or mobile columns coming from one country into another, or even targeting specific targets. As I'm told, the Balakot strikes did happen with the precisions that it did because of the information that we received of 8-figure grid references of the target, and therefore our wonderful, wonderfully capable pilots of our Air Force did us proud by specifically hitting it. It's another matter that the government put out information in bits and pieces, somehow to try and juice that information for the elections. But the fact is that I have raised this point to the highest level, that I think you did disservice to the credibility of and competence of our Air Force by exploiting it in bits and pieces and leaving certain community of naysayers active, who in sheer numbers will be probably more than the entire population of Pakistan. But that's another matter. The fact of the matter is that I think when we have achievements like this, all the facts must come out in the public domain to educate our people, to know that money is being spent well, at least in projects like this, and equally important, to convey a message to our adversaries. Our nearest adversaries are Pakistan and China, and those who do not want to name them in public, I compliment their politeness, but I would rather be straightforward and say that your near-term irritant is Pakistan, your long-term threat is China. And if you don't recognize that, then you can keep whistling in the dark. These countries complement each other's efforts by one having more satellites and missiles than we have, that is China, and the other being provided with anti-satellite related equipment like air defense equipment. Now please understand, and I'm not a technically qualified person, the Air Marshal can educate us better, but I think while an ASAT test happens in space, you can, with some accuracy, hit a satellite-borne military weapon which comes to you, targeting you specifically through your air defense systems of a high quality. India has exhibited this capability from 2006 to 2011. This is much cheaper to achieve, and therefore, whether your one ASAT test will help cover all your shortcomings strategically is a big question. I don't think so, but I think we've made a step in the right direction. Because what we need to understand that here is the first time that we've been able to give a message to our adversaries that at least we have the capacity to protect our space-related assets. We have made huge investments in such technologies, and therefore we are willing not just to be passively monitoring space with those technologies, but using proactive measures to provide them protection if the need arises in the long term. India has undertaken 103 spacecraft missions, of which MESAT in April 2019 was the most recent, but we have also launched the largest number of satellites, of 104 satellites in one mission most recently. These are not mean feats, but we still need to go many, many more miles before we can be comfortable that everything we have worked out for the immediate template is in place. The military usages of satellites are multiple. Because of the electromagnetic radiation emitted or reflected in space, satellites can help us with surveillance by three bands: the visible band, the infrared bands, and the microwave radio bands. At the same time, they allow us to also detect nuclear blasts as well as the launch of ICBMs if we decide to use them. But in the peace and scientific space, they are a huge asset for communication enhancement. They are also, because of their work on very high frequencies, and this is very, very useful for data, metadata, and data transfers, which the military may like to use through satellites. At the same time, they have enormous strategic benefits that they can give to you and your friends, as we have shown with some of our satellites to SAARC countries. So therefore, they are multiple, multi-pronged platforms. It is really your call how you want to use them. Finally, the question that has emerged is about, are we now encouraging a space race? Well, the space race had already begun long before I think we got anywhere near it. Air Marshal brought it out in 1957. Even as late as 2007, China had gone and put craft in the dark side of the moon. All sorts of efforts are on. So I don't think the blame can be brought to bear on India, but we must remember that now that we have entered the club of four, we will be, in all probability, invited to the high table to make the next set of decisions, to make the next set of arguments on what should be the rules of engagement, and should it be limited to a group of four, or whichever country decides to put money into scientific achievements like this, they should be legitimately allowed to get in. Because the surprise that was exhibited, or the negative comments that came on India's test from NASA, quite clearly reflects a mindset that still exists, that I have the right to do it, but you don't, because you don't and you would not be good enough to enter my club. Now that has to change. I'm sounding very blunt and undiplomatic about it, but if you read and if you follow very clearly the kind of pressures that have been brought to bear on India at every stage by countries that have it, by denying you the right to have it, I think, we just have to elbow our way into these rooms where such decisions are made and pull a chair and sit down on the table and say, I'm also party to it because I also have the capability. And I think in a blunt manner, this was a message that India wanted to send out. And finally, two quick points based on what Mr. Amitabh Kant has said. I think there is a need for much greater civil-military coordination and much greater coordination between government agencies and the private sector. Nobody should be allowed to hold on to the hallowed turf that only we are good enough as keepers of national interest to handle this technology or handle this kind of scientific work, because the private sector will bring in the kind of energy that I'm sorry to say is not entirely present in the Government of India PSUs. You've had your great achievement of ASAT, but there is a long list of items that the military complains have never met timelines and deadlines by the organizations like DRDO, whose high point was March 27th ASAT test. The other issue is, how do you involve people who are bright? The lady had brought out this point, who are waiting for jobs. I have suggested it in the past, and I say it again. Just like the army and the other services need to create geek brigades, which is, long-haired, bearded gentlemen coming out of IT speciality and who really have no time for drill square mannerisms, but be given a rank and a structure to work within without hassling them that 6 o'clock in the morning you have to be on parade, but they can show up at 11 as long as within the week they deliver the deliverables. That's good enough. So you have to create those kind of people and leave them to do your cyber work or to impact or monitor others' cyber attacks on you. Mr. Kant also brought out about the linkages between space and cyber. Just like that, there is a need now for creating people who could work in space units or space divisions, etc. Don't restrict them. Don't tell them that you cannot work on national security unless you meet all the physical parameters and you have gone through the rigorous training of a military training institution and you stand straight every time a senior talks to you. But you have to be able to accept that in today's generation of bright young minds, they have no time for this. But they have time to contribute to the national effort. We have to give them the space and the time. And finally, and most importantly, I think what we really need to understand is that there is now no time left for us to be in a self-congratulatory mood. We just need to set out the next set of benchmarks and keep hammering away our presence in the radar screens of the world, that just like everything else, India's century has arrived. Thank you.